First, formulating the research problem. There are two types of research problems, and those are which relate to describing states of nature and which relates to relationship between the variables. The researcher must be in the beginning only about the problem he wants to study. That is, he must decide the general area of interest or aspects of a decided subject matter that he would like to investigate into. Initially, the problem may be stated in a broader way, and then the uncertainty relating to the problem be resolved. Next step is to check the feasibility of a particular solution before a working formulation of the problem can be set up. Thus, the formulation of a general area of interest into a specific research problem constitutes the first step in a scientific inquiry. Essentially, there are two steps that are involved in formulating a research problem. That is, understanding the problem thoroughly and then rehearsing it into meaningful terms from an analytical point of view. The best way of understanding the problem is to discuss it with someone who has some expertise in the matter or somebody who has tried his hands on the related matter. A researcher can seek the help from a guide who is usually an experienced man and has several research problems in his mind. Generally, the guide puts forth problem in general terms, and it is up to the researcher to narrow it down and phrase the problem in operational terms. In private businesses, units, or in governmental organizations, the problem is usually remarked by the administrative agencies with which the researchers can discuss as to how the problem originally came about and what consideration are involved in its possible solution. To take research further, the researcher must acquaint himself with the selected problem by trying to find all the possible variables involved by examining the existing literature. The literature undertaken by the researcher for review may be categorized under two heads: the conceptual literature, which gives insights into the concepts and theories, and the empirical literature, consisting of studies made earlier which are similar to the one proposed. So, the basic of this review is to gain knowledge about the data and other materials that are available for operational purpose and which will enable the researcher to specify his own research problem in a meaningful context. After this, the researcher rephrases the problem into analytical or operational terms. That is to put the problem in as specific term as possible. The problem to be examined must be defined clearly as it will help in discriminating relevant data from irrelevant ones. The researcher must verify the objectivity and validity of the background facts concerning the problem. It is rightly said that the statement of the objective is of basic importance because it determines the data which are to be collected, the characteristics of the data which are relevant, relations which are to be explored, the choice of techniques to be used in these explanations, and the form of the final report. If there are certain important terms, the same should be clearly defined along with the task of formulating the problem. In fact, formulation of the problem often allows a sequential pattern where a number of formulations are set up, each formulation is more specific than the preceding one, each one phrased in more analytical terms, and each more realistic in terms of the available data and resources. Once the problem is stated, brief summary, it should be written down. Extensive literature survey. Undertake extensive literature survey related with the problem. For this purpose, the abstracting and indexing journals and published or unpublished bibliographics are the first place to go to. The researcher may refer academic journals, conferences, preceding government reports, books, etc. Depending on the nature of the problem, the process of the literature survey, the researcher should keep in mind that one source will lead to another. The earlier studies, if any, which are similar to the present study, should be examined more carefully. A good library always, a good library will always proves that to be a great help and support to the researcher at this stage. Then hypothesis formulation or developing the hypothesis after conducting an extensive literature survey, the researcher should take steps to formulate the working hypothesis. Working hypothesis is an assumption made in order to draw and test its logical and empirical consequences. As the hypotheses are the focal point of for the research, which makes it very pertinent to understand the manner in which research hypotheses are formulated. They also affect the manner in which tests must be conducted in the data analysis, and indirectly the quality of data which is required for analysis. In majority of the cases, the formulation of working hypothesis plays an important role. Hypotheses should be very specific, crisp, and limited to the research in hand and present. The main aim of the hypothesis is to guide the researcher by delimiting the area of research and keeping the researcher in the right direction. It also helps in sharpening researchers' thought processes and focuses attention on more important aspects of the research problem or the subject concerned. It also indicates the kind of data that is required to be collected and the data type of method of analysis of data to be applied. A researcher must follow the following approach to formulate working hypotheses. That could be discussions with colleagues and experts about the problem, its origin, and the objective in seeking a solution. Examination of data and records, if available, concerning the problem for possible trends, peculiarities, and other clues. Review of similar studies in the area or of the studies on similar problems, and exploratory personal investigation, which involves original field interviews on a limited scale with interested parties and individuals with a view to secure greater insights into the practical aspects of the problem. Thus, hypothesis formulation is a result of a thought processes undertaken by the researcher with subject experts, which include in-depth study of the subject concerned, examination the available literature. Working hypothesis can prove to be more fruitful when stated in precise and clearly defined terms. It may be noted here that it is not necessary that hypotheses are to be formulated, especially in the case of exploratory or formulative researches. The reason why hypotheses are not required is that exploratory or formulative researches do not aim at testing the hypothesis. But as a general rule, specification of working hypothesis is an important step of the research process in most research problems. Preparing the research design. The research problem having been formulated in clear-cut terms, the next researcher need to take it to prepare a research design. The researcher now needs to state the overall structure of the research within which research would be conducted. In other words, the research will have to build a roadmap on which he has moved. The preparation of such a design will help the researcher to be as efficient as possible, yielding in gathering of optimal information. In other words, in the simpler words, the function of research design is to provide for the collection of relevant evidence with minimal effort, time, and money. The question arises here is that how all these can be achieved. The answer to this question is that it depends mainly on the research purpose. Research purposes may be grouped into four categories: exploration, description, diagnosis, experimentation. A flexible research design which provides opportunity for considering many different aspects of a problem is considered appropriate if the purpose of the research study is that of exploration. But when the purpose is different, that is to make an accurate description of a situation or of an association between variables, the suitable design will be one that minimizes biases and maximizes the reliability of the data collected and analyzed. There are several research designs, such as experimental and non experimental. Experimental designs can be either informal designs, such as completely randomized design, randomized block design, or Latin square design, simple and complex factorial designs. The researcher must decide well in advance that out of two designs, which the researcher wishes to select for his own project. The preparation of the research design appropriate for a particular research problem involves usually the consideration of the following: that the means of obtaining the information, the availability and skills of the researcher and his staff, if any, explanation of the way in which selected means of obtaining information will be organized, and the reasoning leading to the selection. Next, the time available for research and the cost factor relating to research, that is, finance available for the purpose. Then, determining sample design. First thing that needs to be understood is population or universe. It is all the items that are under consideration in any field of inquiry. A complete enumeration of all the items in the population is known as census inquiry. It is presumed that in case of census inquiry, all items are covered, leading to highest accuracy in the result so obtained. However, it's not feasible in practice. Even the slightest element of bias is such an inquiry will have a multiplier effect and get larger and larger as the number of observation increases. Moreover, it is difficult to identify if there is any element of bias. It is also notable that census demand a great deal of time, money, and energy. So not only this, census inquiry is not possible in practice under many circumstances. For instance, blood testing is done only on sample basis. Hence, quite often we select only a few items from the universe for study purposes. The items so selected constitute what is technically called a sample. The researcher must be sure in his mind about the way he or she is going to select the sample for the study. In other words, the researcher must decide in advance the sample design. A sample design is a predefined plan for obtaining a sample from a given population or universe, which is done prior to any data collection. Thus, the plan to select 50 students of college in a certain way constitutes a sample design. Samples can be either probability sample or non-probability samples. In the case of probability sampling, each element has known probability of being selected to be part of the sample. But the non-probability sample do not allow the researchers to determine this kind of probability. Probability sampling can be different types, that is simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified, cluster, whereas non-probability sampling is based on convenience sampling, judgment sampling, and quota sampling techniques. A brief mention of the important sample designs are deliberate sampling, That means it's also known as purposive or non-probability sampling. These sampling methods involve purposive or deliberate or intentional selection of particular units of the universe for constituting a sample which can represent the whole universe. When population elements are selected for including in the sample that is based on convenience or ease of access, it is called as convenience sampling. If a researcher wishes to secure data from, say, apple farmers, he may select a fixed number of farmers and may conduct interviews at these stations. This would be an example of convenience sample of apple farmers. Non probability sampling sometimes may give very biased results, especially when the population is not homogeneous. On the other hand, when the researcher applies his own judgment for selecting items which he considers as the true representative of the population is called judgmental sampling. For example, a judgment sampling of college students might be taken to secure reactions to a new method of teaching. Judgmental sampling is used quite frequently in qualitative research, where the desire happens to be develop hypotheses rather than to generalize the larger population. Simple random sampling is also known as chance sampling or probability sampling, where each and every item in the universe has an equal chance of being included in the sample, and each one of the possible samples, in case of finite universe, has the same probability of being selected. For example, if we have to select a sample of 100 people for a population of 10,000 in village, then we can put the names of all 10,000 persons on slips of paper and conduct a draw of lots. This can be perhaps done with the help of random number tables. In case of random tables, each person is assigned a number from 1 to 10,000. Then 100 5-digit random numbers are selected from the table. To do this, we select some random starting point and then a systematic pattern is followed in proceeding through the table. Here we might start in the fourth row, second column, and proceed down the column to the bottom of the table and then move to the top of the next column to the right. When a number exceeds the limit of the number in the frame, in our case, over 10,000, it is simply passed over and the next number selected that does fall within the relevant range. Since the numbers were placed in the table in a completely random fashion, the resulting sampling is random. This procedure gives each item an equal probability of being selected. In case of infinite population, the selection of each item in a random sample is controlled by the same probability and that successive selections are independent of one another. Systematic sampling, in some instances, the most logical and simple way of sampling is to select every 100th name on a list. As in case of previous example of selecting 100 people from a population of 10,000 villagers. Sampling of this type is known as systematic random sampling. An element of randomness is usually introduced into this kind of sampling by using random numbers to pick up the unit with which to start. The procedure is useful when sampling frame is available in the form of a list. In such design, the selection process starts by picking some random point in the list and then every nth element is selected until the desired number is secured. Then a stratified sampling. In case of population or universe under study constitutes heterogeneous group sample is drawn with the help of stratified sampling technique. So as to obtain a representative sampling techniques, the population is stratified. The population is stratified or grouped into a number of non-overlapping subpopulations or strata. And then sample items are selected from each stratum. If the item selected from each stratum is based on simple random sampling, the entire procedure, first stratification and then simple random sampling, is known as stratified random sampling. Then comes quota sampling. In stratified sampling, the cost of taking random samples from individual strata is often so expensive that interviewers are simply given quota to be filled from different strata. The actual selection items of sample being left to the interviewer's judgment. This is called quota sampling. The size of the quota for each stratum is generally proportionate to the size of that stratum in the population. Quota sampling is thus an important form of non-probability sampling. Quota sampling generally happen to be judgment samples rather than random samples. Then we arrive to the cluster sampling and the area sampling. This sampling involves grouping the population and then selecting the groups or the clusters rather than individual element for inclusion in the sample. Suppose some automobile company wishes to find the post-purchase behavior of their customers who have got their vehicle served from the dealer. Only 1,000 customers have got their vehicle serviced from the dealer itself. The sample size is to be kept, say, 200. For cluster sampling, this list of 10,000 customers or 1,000 customers could be formed into 100 clusters of 100 customers each. The two clusters might be then selected for sample randomly. The sample size must often be larger than the simple random sample to ensure the same level of accuracy being, because it's a cluster sampling procedure, potential for order bias and other sources of error are usually accentuated. The cluster approach can, however, make the sampling procedure relatively easier and increases the efficiency of fieldwork, especially in case of personal interviews. Area sampling is quite similar to cluster and is often considered when the total geographical area under study happens to be a big one. So under area sampling, the total area is divided into a number of smaller non-overlapping areas. That is generally called geographical clusters. Then a number of these smaller areas are randomly selected, as in case of cluster spilling. And hence all units in these small areas are included in the sample. So area sampling is suitable especially in case of lack of list of whole population concern. It also makes the field interviewing more efficient and effective, since interviewer can do a number of interviews at each location. Then multi-stage sampling. This is a further development of the concept of cluster sampling. This technique is meant for large-scale inquiries, which may extend to a considerably large geographical area, like an entire country. Under multi-stage sampling, the first stage is to select larger primary sampling units, such as states, then districts, then town, and then finally certain families within the selected towns. If the techniques of random sampling is applied at all stages, the sampling procedures is described as multi-stage random sampling. Sequential sampling. This is comparatively a complex sampling method, wherein the ultimate size of sample is not fixed in advance. However, it is determined according to mathematical decisions on the basis of information obtained as the survey progresses. This design is generally applied under acceptance sampling plan in the context of statistical quality control. Snowball entrusting sampling type. It's an item of the total sample is chosen randomly. While gathering a data, reference is asked from the respondent itself, and the referred person becomes another unit of the sample, and process goes on till the full sample size achieved. Then is mixed sampling. In practice, one or combination of several of methods of sampling described above may well be used within the same study, in which case it is called mixed sampling. So it may be pointed out here that normally one should resort to random sampling so that bias can be eliminated and sampling error can be estimated. But purposive sampling is considered desirable when the universe happens to be small and unknown characteristics of it is to be studied intensively. Also, there are conditions under which sample design other than random sampling may be considered better for reasons like convenience and low cost. The sample design to be used must be decided by the researcher taking into consideration the nature of the inquiry and other related factors. Data collection. In dealing with any real life problem, it is sometimes found that data at hand are sufficient or data that we have may possibly is insufficient. And thus, it becomes important to collect data that are appropriate and adequate according to the research problem that we are studying. So there are several ways of collecting the data in appropriate manner, which differ considerably in context of money costs, time, and other resources at the disposal of the researcher. There are two types of data collection techniques, very simple and very well known, primary and secondary. The primary data can be collected either through experiment or through survey. If the researcher conducts an experiment, he observes some quantitative measurement or the data with the help of which the researcher examines the truth contained in his hypothesis. But in the case of a survey, data can be collected by any one or more of the following ways. First, observation. This method implies the collection of information by means of investigators' own observation. But without interviewing the respondents, the information thus obtained relates to what is currently happening and is not influenced by either the past behavior or future intentions or attitude or behavior of respondents. This method is undoubtedly an expensive method, and the information provided by this method is also very limited. As such, this method is not suitable in inquiries very large samples are undertaken for study. Personal interview. In this case, the researcher follows a strict procedures and tries to find answers to a set of preconceived questions through personal interviews. So this method of collecting data is usually carried out in a structured way where output depends upon the availability of the interviewer to a great extent. Telephone interviews. This kind of method of collecting information involves contacting the respondents on telephone itself. This is not a method that is very widely used. However, this method plays an important role in industrial surveys in developed regions, especially when the survey has to be accomplished in shorter duration of time. Mailing of questionnaires. The researcher and the respondent do not come in contact with each other if this kind of method of survey is undertaken. Questionnaires are mailed to select respondents with a request to return the filled in questionnaires. It is one of the most extensively used method in various economic and business surveys. Before applying this method, usually a pilot study is undertaken for testing the questionnaire. Pilot study is done to reveal the weaknesses or shortcomings, if any, of the questionnaires. Questionnaires to be used must be prepared very carefully so that it may prove to be effective in collecting the relevant information. Otherwise, an ill-stated questionnaire may lead the researcher in wrong direction and resulting in waste of efforts, time, and money. Then comes schedule. So under this method, the enumerators are appointed and given comprehensive training. The trainees are provided with schedules containing relevant questions to be asked from the respondents. These enumerators go to respondents with the schedules. Data are collected by filing up the schedules by the enumerators themselves on the basis of replies given by respondents. Much depends upon the capability of enumerators so far as this method is connected. Some occasional field checks on the work of enumerators may ensure sincere and authentic work. Here, the researcher should select one of these methods of collecting the data, taking into consideration the nature of investigation, objective and scope of the inquiry, financial resources, available time, and the desired degree of accuracy. Though he should pay attention to all these factors, but much depends upon the ability and experience of the researcher. So, in this context, Paoli very aptly remarked that in collection of statistical data, common sense is the chief requisite and experience the chief teacher. Next is data analysis or analysis of data. Execution of the project is perceived to be very important step in the research process. If the execution of the project progresses on correct lines, the data to be collected would be adequate and dependable. The researcher must take the systematic manner and in stipulated time how the project can be executed. If the survey is to be conducted with the help of structured questionnaire, data can be readily machine processed. If the data are to be collected through interviewers, proper arrangement needs to be done for proper selection and training of the interviewers. The training thus rendered may be given with the help of reading materials, instruction manuals, which explain clearly the job of the interviews at each subsequent step. The occasional field checks should also be undertaken to ensure that the interviewers are doing their assigned job sincerely, efficiently, as desired. A careful watch should be kept for contingencies or some unanticipated factors in order to keep the survey as much realistic as possible. Steps should be taken to ensure that the survey is under full statistical control so that the collected information in accordance with the predefined standard of accuracy. It is also seen that sometimes respondents do not cooperate. If some respondents do not cooperate, some suitable methods should be in place for execution to tackle and deal with the non-responses problem. Is to make list of the non-respondents and take a small subsample of them, and then with the help of experts, vigorous efforts can be made to be securing position. So once the data have collected, the next task of the researcher is to analyze the collected data. Analyze of the data requires a number of closely related operations, such as establishments of categories, the application of these categories to raw data through coding, tabulation, and then drawing statistical inferences. The clumsy data should necessarily be condensed into a few manageable groups and tables for further analysis. Thus, researchers should first classify the raw data into some meaningful, purposeful, and usable categories. Coding operation is usually done at this stage, through which the categories of data are transformed into symbols that may be tabulated and counted. Editing in the procedure that further improves the quality of the data for coding. Coding also sets the base of tabulation. The tabulation is a part of technical procedure wherein the categorized data are put in the form of different tablets or tables. So the mechanical device can be used at this point of juncture. A great deal of data, especially in large inquiries, easily tabulated by the computer. Computers are not only save time, but also make it easier and possible to study large number of variables that are affecting a problem simultaneously. So data analysis works that take place after tabulation is usually based on the computation of various percentage coefficients, etc. By different well-defined statistical applying different well-defined statistical formulae and equations. In this process of data analysis, relationships or differences supporting or conflicting with original or new hypothesis should be subjected to tests of significance to determine with what validity data can be said to indicate any results. For instance, if there are two samples of monthly salaries, each sample being drawn from companies in different parts of the same city, giving two different mean values, that our problem may be whether the two mean values are significantly different or the set differences is just a matter of chance. Through the use of statistical tests, we can establish whether such a difference is actual, the real one, or it is the result of some random fluctuations only. If the difference happens to be real, the inferences will be that two samples come from different universes. And if the difference is due to chance, the conclusion would be that the two samples belong to the same universe. Similarly, the technique of analysis of variance can help us in analyzing whether three or more varieties of seeds grown on certain fields yield significantly different results or not. In brief, the researcher can analyze the collected data with the help of various statistical measures. Next comes hypothesis testing. So, after analyzing the data as stated above, the researcher comes in a position to test the hypothesis formulated earlier. If any, the question arises here. The question arises here are like, does the fact support the hypothesis, or does the fact support the hypothesis, or they happen to be contrary? This is the usual question which should be answered while testing hypothesis. There are various tests such as chi-square test, t-test, f-test, etc. have been developed by statisticians for the purpose of testing hypothesis. The hypothesis may be tested with the help of applications of one or more of such tests, depending upon the nature and objective of research inquiry. Hypothesis testing will result in either accepting the hypothesis or in rejecting the hypothesis. If the researcher has not formulated the hypothesis earlier, generalizations established on the basis of data may be stated as hypotheses to be tested by subsequent researchers in times to come. Generalization and interpretation. If a hypothesis is tested and upheld many times, it may be possible for a researcher to reach at generalization, that is, to build a general theory as a matter of fact. The real value of research lies in its capability to arrive at certain generalization. So if the researcher had no hypothesis to start with, he might seek to explain findings of the study on the basis of some theory, which is known as interpretation. So the process of interpretation may quite often elicit new questions, which in turn may lead to further researches. Then preparation of the report. Finally, after testing the hypothesis and doing all the further above steps and the generalization and interpretation, the next step of the researcher is to finally write the report of what has been done. Report writing must be done with utmost care, keeping in mind the different points that are suggestive in nature and are widely used. However, researcher may opt for putting a variation in the format based on the need and the requirement of the research undergone. The layout of the report should be preliminary pages, then the main text and the final matter. So in the preliminary pages, the report should carry the title of the study, followed by acknowledgements and forward. Then there should be a table of contents, which should be followed by a list of tables and a list of graphs and charts that have been presented in the report, if any. Then the main text of the report generally has the following parts. There will be an introduction. Introduction should contain a clear statement of the objective. of the present research, an elaborate explanation of the methodology that has been adopted in accomplishing the research. Then the scope of the study should be mentioned in this part. Summary of findings. So after the introduction, the researcher should present a statement of finding and recommendations in a very non-technical or simple language. If the findings are extensive, they should be presented in a summarized manner. Then main report. The main body of the report should be presented in logical sequences and then broken down into readily identifiable sections. Last conclusion towards the end of the main text, the researcher should again put down the results of his research clearly and precisely and then summarize the report. In fact, it is the final summing up. So at the end of the report, appendices should be incorporated in respect of all technical data, bibliography, that is, list of books, journal reports, etc., referred, should be also given in the end. Bibliography should be written in such a manner that anybody who comes across the present study should be able to find the literature referred by the researchers of the study. Index should also be especially given or especially in a published research report. Report should be written in a concise and objective style in very simple language, avoiding vague expressions such as it seems, there may be, and then like, etc. Charts and illustration in the main report should be used only if they present the information more clearly. Calculated confidence limits must be mentioned, and the various constraints experienced in conducting research operation may as well be stated to present the report in a very systematic manner. So here the very deep and intense research process steps are done, and we have got the insights of each steps.